Welcome to the use and functions of the Biller Desktop tutorial. This tutorial will cover all functionality within the Surgical Biller Desktop and walk you through how it is used in typical workflows. Specifically, we will explain the intended purpose of the desktop, demonstrate how to compile patient lists, explain all functionality within the desktop including all header buttons, footer buttons, and menu buttons, and we will explain how the desktop is used within the context of several common workflows and scenarios. We'll also discuss charge reconciliation. Please be aware that this tutorial assumes the audience has knowledge of the surgical tracker and the embedded nursing documentation tools. Implementation customers should attend Applications 1 training before viewing this tutorial. Let's get started. So you may be wondering, what is the Surgical Biller Desktop? And how will it help my organization? Well, this desktop provides you with the tools you need to review your surgical charts to ensure they are complete and accurate. It's typically used by the person or people in your department that are responsible for auditing charts and ensuring that patient charges are correct. It includes tools that allow the user to review and modify the nursing documentation, review and modify the charges, and to close each chart. This is an important step because closing the chart is the trigger that will send charges to the patient accounting application. Let's take a closer look. Here's the desktop. As you can see, in the center of the screen is a listing of cases including the status of each case, the operation date, patient name, account number, and procedure that was performed. Beneath the patient list, users can view an additional details section that will show more important information about the green highlighted case above. Specifically, this section will display the surgeon, registration status, and other key patient identifiers. Along the top of the screen are the body buttons. Selecting each of these function buttons allows for users to filter the compiled list to see all patients of a like case status: open, closed, deferred, or canceled. The Open button provides a work list for users so that they know how many cases still need to be reviewed and verified. Along the bottom of the screen are the Footer buttons, and along the right side of the screen in the menu region are the Function buttons. We're going to cover all of these function buttons. Let's get started by compiling our patient list. Upon accessing the Biller Desktop, the user will be brought into the Criteria screen. From here, the user can use various criteria to filter their list. Patient lists can be filtered by facility, date range, surgical area, or even specific procedures. Oftentimes, the auditor will want to get started by reviewing all cases on a specific day, or date range. Once a date range has been entered in the From and Through Date fields, then you can click the Compile Footer button. Now you're presented with your patient list. Notice in the header region that the Open button is highlighted and that we're only being presented with charts that are in an open status. You can click on any of the header buttons to further filter your display. For example, maybe you want to view charts that have already been closed. We'll go ahead and click on the Closed button. Now you're presented with cases that are in a closed status. Before we go any further, I'd like to explain the 4 different case statuses. All cases start in an open status. Cases remain in an open status throughout the perioperative episode. Once the surgical episode is over and all perioperative nursing documentation is complete, the chart can be audited. The chart should be audited to ensure the charges are accurate and the nursing documentation is complete. Once the audit is complete, the status can be updated to closed. This is the trigger that sends charges to the patient accounting application. It also locks the chart, preventing any further edits to the nursing documentation. Most cases will simply go from open to closed status. However, there are 2 other statuses as well. Cases should be put in deferred status when the patient shows for surgery and some nursing documentation has been entered, but the procedure was aborted. In this scenario, you will want to save your nursing documentation and possibly generate some patient charges, but you won't be able to complete all required fields, such as the actual performed procedure or certain case times. The deferred status will allow you to bypass documentation requirements, lock the record to prevent further edits, and, if appropriate, generate patient charges. The canceled status can be used to cancel a chart that was scheduled in error. For example, Maybe a duplicate account was accidentally created and the nurse documented against the incorrect account. By putting the chart into a canceled status, you're removing all documentation from the EMR. However, it's important to keep in mind that the data is not purged. There is still an audit trail of that documentation. Now let's take a look at the footer buttons. Right now we're looking at the patient list. Notice that the list button is indented. You can also click on the criteria button to go back to the compile screen. Remember, this is where you enter the criteria that determines which cases will be presented on the list. We're going to review the cases for a specified data range of a couple days. Once your criteria is defined, simply click on Compile. You're now presented with your patient list. By default, you're presented with all cases in an open status. Next, let's look at the summary. Let's go ahead and click on the Summary footer button. You're now presented with the summary of charges for all cases in your patient list. It's broken down in the left column by the various case statuses. The table shows you the number of cases in each status, as well as the total dollar amount in time charges, supply charges, implant charges, procedure charges, and other charges. Other charges are those charges captured using the additional charges routine. And in the far right column, the total charges are presented. This presents you with some interesting data, but let's go back to List. Let's click on the List footer button. Now let's look at the Billing List footer. This footer button will allow you to print a paper copy of a patient's charges. Notice that patient Shannon Whitman is highlighted. Now let's click on the Billing List button. Here is the selection criteria screen. Here is where you choose the report or reports you wish to print. Notice that the patient that was highlighted on the list has now defaulted into this screen. You can simply click the OK button in the footer to print the report. The billing list outlines each individual charge that is generated through documentation throughout the case. The list will include charges generated by time, procedure, supplies, implants, and additional charges. Here, you will also see the charge code associated to the chargeable instance along with the quantity, which is how many times that charge is applied to the patient's account. Before we move on, let's take a close look at the options within the selection criteria screen. Notice the two choices within the report section of the screen. It's important to understand the difference between a preliminary billing list and a billing list. You can run a preliminary billing list for any case that is in an open status. You can run a billing list for any case in a closed or deferred status. It's important to keep in mind when selecting your criteria. Now let's take a look at the report types. We already printed the report for a single patient, so now we will use the By Rooms radio button. Now you have some new selection criteria fields to utilize. You can print billing lists for multiple cases at once by date range. You can also select specific surgical areas or operating rooms. Also notice the two format options, Summary and Detail. Next, we're going to take a look at the menu region. First, we'll take a look at these four buttons: Close Case, Reopen Case, Defer Case, and Cancel Case. We discussed these statuses previously in this tutorial, but let's review. Notice that the highlighted patient, Whitman Shannon, is in an open status. Let's assume we have completed our audit of this patient's chart. You will now want to close the chart and send the charges to patient accounting by selecting the Close Case button. Now under the Closed tab, notice that the chart status has changed to Closed. Closing the chart means that the documentation is now locked and edits cannot be made. Closing the chart also triggers the charges to go to patient accounting. Notice the Reopen button in the menu region. If you discover a problem in the patient chart after it has been closed and need to make further edits, you can use the Reopen button to reopen the chart. However, these are some important things to keep in mind when reopening a chart. Reopened cases will appear under the Open tab. There are two important parameters that drive this functionality. First is the Days to Reopen Case parameter. This parameter does exactly what it says. So based on this field setting, the user has a 5-day window during which they can reopen a closed chart. After the 5th day, users will no longer be able to reopen the chart without modifying the parameters. The other important parameter is the Bar Batch Delay Hours parameter. As I mentioned, charges will be sent to patient accounting once the chart is closed. This parameter determines what will happen to the charges if the case is reopened. Notice that the parameter is set to 12 hours. If a case is reopened, the charges will not immediately be credited to the patient account. The user now has 12 hours to edit the chart and close it once again. If the user edits and recloses the chart within the 12-hour window, then only those charges that are added, edited, or removed from the case will be sent to the RCG application. So what happens if I don't close the case within the 12-hour window? Well, once 12 hours passes, SIR will send credit transactions to patient accounting for all charges on the chart. Then, when the case is eventually closed again, all charges will again be sent to patient accounting. In the end, the patient charges will be accurate, but the billing department will have a lot of credits and debts to sort through. Okay, let's go back to the biller desktop and the case statuses. Next is the Defer Case button. A case should be marked as deferred if the nursing documentation was started, but the case was aborted. Let's walk through an example. Assume a patient arrives on their day of surgery and makes it as far as your preoperative area. The preoperative nurse begins his or her documentation in the preoperative chart, but the surgeon then decides to not perform the procedure and thus cancel the case. In that event, the remaining intraoperative and PACU documentation will not be entered. There are required fields in the nursing documentation, such as case times or the actual procedure, that will not be documented. Therefore, it will not be possible to change the status of this case to closed. Instead, charge should be flagged as deferred. Let's go ahead and click on the Deferred button. Deferring a case is very similar to closing a case in that the chart will be locked, thus preventing users from making any further documentation edits. However, certain decisions need to be made on the screen. First, you must select a reason for deferring the case. Next, you must determine whether or not you want to send patient charges to patient accounting. You also have the option of entering a free text defer comment. And finally, you must decide whether you want to send the record to the eChart or electronic legal record. Also notice the Print Requirements button at the bottom of the screen. It is possible to configure individual fields in the chart as required when deferring a case. In this example, there are no required fields. We will now move on to the charge reconciliation portion of this tutorial, where we will review how to view charge rejections and how to correct them. The Bar Batch desktop is where we view charge rejections. Charge rejections notify us when charges have not processed correctly in the system. Look for the Surgical Services Charges Journal to see all the charges and rejections from the SIR module. The Daily Summary section reflects all of the accepted charges and rejected charges for each application journal by day. There will be a Surgical Services Journal that will reflect all the charges captured in the SIR module. The charges will post on the Batch desktop after the charts are closed or deferred on the Biller desktop. The All Unresolved Charge Rejections section will display the total rejected charges and rejected transactions to date. Here you can view the dollar total of the rejected charges as well as the transactions which reflect the number of rejected charge codes. If there are rejected charges from SIR, you will be able to highlight the Surgical Services Journal in the All Unresolved Charge Rejections section. Once this journal is highlighted, you can select the Process Rejections footer button in order to view and address the transactions. The Process Rejections footer launches to the work list displaying all of the transactions for the highlighted journal. Across the top of the screen, each tab will display the different statuses of the transaction, which are rejected, deleted, posted, corrected, or all statuses. Each line reflects the account number for a closed or deferred surgical chart. Here, you can view the charge code that caused the rejection and the amount associated to the code. The last column will display the number of days the rejection has been unresolved. When a transaction from the list is highlighted, the information below will populate specific to the account that was selected. The Rejection Reasons section outlines why the charge code was rejected. Keep in mind that more than one reason may be responsible for a rejection. Once the rejection is reviewed, steps should be taken to correct the error depending on the rejection reason. Once it is addressed and corrected, the user can begin the process of processing the rejection on the Charge Rejections work list. The process screen displays detailed information on the selected charge transaction. Under the Original section is the information associated to the originally documented charge code, including the patient account, service date and time, and the faulty charge code. Within the Corrected section, users are able to enter new information in any of the fields if necessary. Once all of the corrected information is updated, the user can select the Post footer in order to place the transaction in a posted status. This will serve as a hold area for transactions that have been addressed. Once the user selects the Post footer, the transaction will appear under the Posted tab of the work list. The transaction will remain in a posted status until the midnight run. Once the midnight run is complete, if the charge code was in fact corrected, then the transaction will fall under the Corrected tab. If the charge rejection reason was not corrected, then the transaction will repopulate the Rejected tab and will need to be addressed again through the same process. Now you should have a full understanding of the Biller desktop and addressing charge rejections. Thank you for watching.